What if everything you thought you knew about dictators was wrong? Every strongman who ever seized power followed a recognizable pattern. The fiery orator who whipped crowds into a frenzy, the military man who marched his troops into the capital, the ideological true believer who had dreamed of conquest since his youth. Adolf Hitler raved and raged before screaming mobs in Munich beer halls. Benito Mussolini thundered from balconies in Rome, arms spread wide, jaw jutting forward like a man posing for his own monument. Mao Zedong led a military revolution across thousands of miles of Chinese wilderness. Francisco Franco rose on the back of a military coup backed by tanks and foreign air support. Even the lesser tyrants of the 20th century, the Pol Pots and the Kim Il-sungs, fit recognizable molds. The ideologue, the general, the charismatic frontman. But then there was Josef Stalin. He was not an orator. He was barely even Russian. He did not lead armies into battle in his youth, he robbed banks. He did not charm his way to power, he bored his way there through committee meetings and organizational paperwork while his rivals were out making speeches. He did not purge only his enemies, which every dictator does. He purged his friends, his loyalists, his most devoted servants, the very people who had built his power with their own hands. And when the greatest military catastrophe in human history was launched against his country in the summer of 1941, he did not stand firm. He collapsed. He locked himself in his dacha and refused to speak to anyone for days while his empire began to burn. And yet, when the smoke cleared, Stalin was still standing. Every other major dictator of the 20th century ended in execution, suicide, capture, or exile. Stalin died in his own bed, the undisputed master of a superpower that stretched across 11 time zones at the age of 74. So how? How did a short, pockmarked, half-Georgian seminary dropout who could barely speak Russian without an accent become the most powerful man in the world? How did a man who trusted no one, loved no one, and ultimately suspected everyone of plotting against him manage to outlast every rival, every purge, and every invasion thrown at him? In this video, we are going to find out. So without further ado, let us start at the very beginning, with a boy born in a small town in the mountains of Georgia, a boy nobody expected to change the world. Ioseb Vissarionis Dzeyugashvili was born on December 18, 1878, in the small Georgian town of Gori, nestled in a valley between the Caucasus Mountains in what was then the Russian Empire. This detail alone already sets him apart from nearly every dictator who came after him. Hitler was Austrian, deeply embedded in German nationalist culture from birth. Mussolini was Italian to his core, raised on romantic notions of Roman imperial glory. Mao was Han Chinese, connected to the oldest continuous civilization on Earth. But Stalin was Georgian, member of a people with their own ancient language, their own alphabet, their own traditions, their own identity, entirely distinct from the Russians he would one day rule. For his entire career, this fact followed him like a shadow. His Russian would always carry a Georgian accent. His enemies, including Trotsky and Lenin at various points, would use his nationality against him, dismissing him as a crude provincial. But Stalin would spend his entire life transforming this liability into something else. Proof that he stood above mere nationality, that he was the servant not of any one people, but of a universal ideology that belonged to everyone and no one. His father, Vissarion Dzeyugashvili, was a cobbler, a man who drank too much and beat his wife and son with disturbing frequency. By some accounts, Vissarion beat young Ioseb so severely and so often that the boy developed a lasting hatred of authority figures rooted in physical fear, a fear he spent his entire adult life converting into the most extreme possible form of control over others. His mother, Ekaterine, known as Keiki, was the defining figure of his early years. She was devout, hard-working, and fiercely ambitious for her surviving son, 3 children before Ioseb having died in infancy. She cleaned houses, she took in washing, she did whatever she had to do to keep the family alive and to give her boy a future. That future, in her mind, was the priesthood. Kika Yugashvili wanted her son to become a Georgian Orthodox priest, and she pushed and scraped and sacrificed until, in 1888, she managed to enroll him in the Gori Church School, where he proved to be a brilliant student. He was genuinely gifted. Excellent memory, sharp intelligence, a capacity for hard-focused work that he would carry through his entire life. He also developed somewhere in those early years a personality trait that would define everything that followed, an absolute, unbreakable refusal to show weakness in the face of pain or humiliation. When other boys mocked his poverty or his pockmarked face, the result of a childhood bout of smallpox, he did not shrink. He remembered, and eventually he made them regret it. In 1894, at the age of 15, Josef Dugashvili won a scholarship to the Tiflis Theological Seminary in Tbilisi, the capital of Georgia. This is one of the most fascinating and underappreciated details of Stalin's entire biography, because it means that the man who would one day make atheism a state ideology and murder hundreds of thousands of clergymen received his formative intellectual education inside a religious institution designed to train priests. And it was a rigorous education. The seminary taught Latin, Greek, theology, church history, and a strict, structured approach to debate and argument. It also maintained an atmosphere of total surveillance, with monks monitoring the boys' reading material, their conversations, their movements, and their associations. Stalin hated the surveillance, but he learned from it. He learned what it looked like, how it operated, what it could accomplish, and one day he would deploy it on a scale the monks of Tiflis could never have imagined. At the seminary, Josef began reading the banned books that circulated secretly among the students, works of socialist theory, Russian revolutionary writing, Georgian nationalist literature. He discovered Karl Marx. He discovered the concept of class struggle, of history as a battlefield between the exploiters and the exploited, and something clicked into place in the mind of a boy who had watched his mother scrub other people's floors while his father beat her. In 1899, before finishing his studies, he left the seminary, officially citing illness, though the real reason appears to have been a final confrontation with the administration over his reading material and his increasingly radical associations. He was 20 years old. He had no degree, no trade, no family money, and nowhere to go. He had one thing: a consuming belief that the world was unjust and that it needed to be violently remade, and that he was the person to help remake it. He joined the Social Democratic Labour Party of Georgia, a Marxist revolutionary organisation, and began what would become a decade of underground political work, evading the Tsarist secret police, the Okhrana, writing revolutionary pamphlets, organising strikes among the Tiflis railway workers, and building a reputation as a tireless, dependable, utterly fearless operative. He was arrested for the first time in 1902 and exiled to Siberia, the first of many such exiles. He escaped from Siberia in 1904 and returned to the Caucasus, where he resumed his revolutionary activities with increased intensity. The Tsarist government arrested him again. He escaped again. This happened so many times with such regularity that historians have spent considerable energy debating whether Stalin's repeated escapes were the product of his own cunning or of an arrangement with the Okhrana, some suggesting that he may have been an informer at various points in his early career. The evidence is disputed, the records incomplete, and the question has never been definitively resolved, which is precisely the kind of historical ambiguity that Stalin, who controlled historical archives for 30 years, would have been very comfortable with. What is not disputed is what he did in the years between 1905 and 1912. He became an organizer of bank robberies, not metaphorical bank robberies, actual, physical, armed bank robberies conducted in broad daylight to fund the Bolshevik faction of the Social Democratic Party. The most famous of these was the Tiflis bank robbery of June 1907, in which a group of Bolshevik fighters led by a man named Kamo attacked a convoy of money being transferred to the state bank in Tiflis, killing 40 people and wounding 50 more in an attack that involved bombs thrown from rooftops and a running gun. Battle through the city streets. The haul was approximately 341,000 rubles, equivalent to several $1 million today. Stalin did not throw the bombs himself. He organized the operation from a distance, but his role was well known within the party. Even Lenin, who authorized these so-called expropriations as a funding mechanism, eventually began to distance himself from the most violent ones as the party came under pressure from the international socialist movement to stop criminal activity. Stalin was known as Koba in those years after a Georgian folk hero, a bandit avenger figure from Georgian literature. He liked that name. It suited the life he was living, outside the law, outside respectable society, operating in shadows, answerable only to the cause. This is one of the sharpest contrasts between Stalin and virtually every other major dictator of the 20th century. Hitler, before his political career, was a failed art student and a World War I corporal who genuinely believed his own ideology from the beginning, an ideological true believer before he was a politician. Mussolini was a journalist and a professional agitator who built his power through rhetoric and performance. Mao was a librarian's assistant and then a military leader who led one of history's most famous military campaigns. Stalin, in his formative years, was essentially a gangster in the service of a revolutionary party. He organized violence, he handled money, he managed networks of informers and operatives, he planned logistics, and he disappeared into the landscape when the police came looking. These are not the skills of a visionary ideologue. They are the skills of a professional criminal, and they would prove, in the long run, to be far more useful for holding power than any amount of ideological passion or rhetorical genius. Vladimir Lenin first became aware of Josef Stalin, who had by now begun using the revolutionary pseudonym Koba sometime around 1905, and the two men had a complicated relationship from the very beginning. Lenin needed men like Koba. Tough, reliable, willing to do the dirty work that the more intellectually refined party members found distasteful. Koba organized, Koba moved money. Koba dealt with the practical necessities of running an underground revolutionary movement in a police state. Lenin valued this, but he also, at various points, found Stalin crude, difficult, and unreliable in a different sense. Not unreliable in his loyalty, but unreliable in his judgment, prone to personal vendettas and organizational self-dealing that sometimes created more problems than they solved. At the famous Prague Conference of 1912, Lenin reorganized the Bolshevik faction into a separate party and began elevating the most promising members. He had Koba co-opted onto the Central Committee even in absentia. The younger man was in Siberian exile at the time and later summoned him to Krakow to discuss party business. Lenin assigned him to write a major theoretical work on the question of Marxism and the national question, a subject on which Stalin, as a non-Russian living within the multinational Russian Empire, had direct personal experience. The resulting essay, finished in 1913, was well received, and Lenin praised it highly. But then the Tsarist police arrested Stalin again in February 1913, and this time they sent him somewhere he could not easily escape from, the remote Siberian region of Turkhansk above the Arctic Circle, where the winters lasted most of the year and the nearest railway was hundreds of miles away. He remained there in genuine cold, genuine isolation, and genuine misery, until the February Revolution of 1917 swept away the Romanov dynasty and freed all political prisoners. He returned to Petrograd in March 1917, the revolution already underway, and found a world transforming around him. The Tsar was gone. The provisional government was stumbling. Lenin was still in Swiss exile, preparing to return. And Stalin, for the first time in years, found himself at the center of events, rather than frozen on the periphery. When Lenin finally returned to Russia in April 1917, sealed in his famous armoured train car arranged by the Germans who wanted nothing more than to destabilize Russia and knock it out of the war, he arrived with his April theses and immediately radicalized the Bolshevik position. No cooperation with the provisional government, immediate peace with Germany, all power to the Soviets. Stalin had been moving in a more conciliatory direction before Lenin's return. He adjusted his position quickly once the leader arrived. This pattern of rapid ideological repositioning was another characteristic that distinguished Stalin from the ideologically rigid true believers. He was not attached to ideas. He was attached to power. And he understood, instinctively, that power in the Bolshevik movement flowed from Lenin. When Lenin said jump, Stalin asked how high, and he adjusted his theoretical positions accordingly. This was not cowardice. It was calculation, and it was a skill that almost none of his rivals ever mastered. The October Revolution of November 1917, when the Bolsheviks seized power in Petrograd, was the defining moment of the century, and Stalin played a modest but real role in it. He was not on the front lines. That was Trotsky's glory. He was not the theorist who had conceived the revolution. That was Lenin. He was not the most brilliant orator. That was also Trotsky, who was also a genuinely gifted military organizer. Stalin was in the background on the committee, handling the organizational details that nobody else wanted to handle. He was appointed Commissar of Nationalities in the first Soviet government, a position that gave him responsibility for the dozens of non-Russian ethnic groups within the former empire, a job that sounded secondary but was actually enormously important for a country trying to hold together a multinational state during a civil war. He was also a member of the first Politburo, the supreme governing body of the new state, one of only 5 people in the world who sat at the very apex of power in what was now, officially, Soviet Russia. During the Russian Civil War from 1918 to 1922, Stalin established himself as a military and political commissar, someone sent by the central government to oversee military operations and ensure ideological reliability. He served at Tsaritsyn, the city on the Volga, that would later be renamed Stalingrad and later Volgograd, and his performance there was a preview of everything that would follow in World War II. He was ruthless. He was willing to override military experts. He ignored orders from Trotsky. He executed people he suspected of disloyalty or incompetence. And he ultimately achieved results, though often at appalling cost. His conflict with Trotsky during the Civil War was intensely personal and would define Soviet politics for the next decade. Trotsky, brilliant, arrogant, and utterly certain of his own intellectual superiority, dismissed Stalin as a grey mediocrity, a phrase he would repeat often and would eventually regret enormously. Stalin remembered every insult. He collected them the way other men collect stamps, cataloguing them in the vast archive of his memory, waiting for the moment when he could use them. It was during the Civil War years that Stalin first emerged as a genuine danger to people who underestimated him. He had people shot who he believed were undermining the war effort. He ignored the authority of men who outranked him when he judged their orders to be wrong. He built personal networks of loyalty within the military and party structures he passed through. Men who owed him favors, who had received his protection, who understood that Stalin's friendship was worth having and his enmity was worth avoiding. He was building, piece by piece, the architecture of personal power that would eventually dwarf everything else in the Soviet system. In 1922, Lenin appointed Stalin to the newly created position of General Secretary of the Communist Party. This was the moment that changed everything, though almost nobody understood that at the time. The General Secretary was supposed to be an organizational role, managing the party bureaucracy, handling personnel files, overseeing the day-to-day administrative functioning of the vast party apparatus. It was not considered a prestigious position. The important roles, in the eyes of the party intellectuals, were the theorists, the orators, the commissioners of major portfolios like foreign affairs or military. Trotsky had no interest in being general secretary. Neither did Zinoviev or Kamenev, the other major figures in the Bolshevik leadership. The job sounded boring. It was beneath them, so Stalin took it and he transformed it into the single most powerful position in the Soviet Union, because he understood something that Trotsky and the others did not. In a one-party state, whoever controls the personnel files controls everything. Whoever decides who gets which job, who gets promoted, who gets transferred to a comfortable posting in Moscow, and who gets sent to manage a collective farm in Kazakhstan, that person controls every ambitious individual in the entire country. And Stalin controlled all of that, every appointment, every promotion, every transfer, from the moment he became General Secretary. Lenin began to have doubts about Stalin almost immediately. By late 1922, Lenin's health was failing catastrophically. He had suffered a series of strokes that would leave him incapacitated until his death in January 1924. In his final months of clarity, he dictated what became known as his testament, a document that assessed the major figures in the Bolshevik leadership and offered advice on who should lead the party after his death. The section on Stalin is devastating. Lenin wrote that Stalin had accumulated enormous power in his hands, and he was not sure that Stalin would always know how to use that power with sufficient caution. He recommended that the party consider removing Stalin from the position of General Secretary. He also added a postscript, reportedly after a personal incident in which Stalin was rude to Lenin's wife, Nadezhda Krupskaya, over the telephone, in which he described Stalin as too rude and recommended his removal. This document, had it been published and acted upon, might have ended Stalin's career. It was not. The other members of the leadership, Zinoviev and Kamenev especially, who feared Trotsky more than they feared Stalin, chose to suppress it. They calculated that a manageable Stalin was preferable to an unmanageable Trotsky. It was one of the most catastrophic political miscalculations in human history. When Lenin died in January 1924, the struggle for succession began immediately, and it unfolded in a way that no observer at the time could have predicted. Trotsky was the obvious heir apparent in terms of intellectual prestige and revolutionary credentials. He had organized the October seizure of power. He had built the Red Army that won the Civil War. He was internationally famous. He was Lenin's closest associate in the public mind. He was also ill, prone to hesitation at key moments, and deeply reluctant to engage in the kind of grubby organizational infighting that was now the arena of Soviet politics. Stalin maneuvered with extraordinary skill, allying first with Zinoviev and Kamenev against Trotsky, then, once Trotsky was marginalized, turning against Zinoviev and Kamenev, and allying with Bukharin and the right wing of the party. The alliances shifted constantly, always leaving Stalin in the center, always pointing toward the isolation of whoever was currently the most dangerous rival. By 1929, every significant alternative to Stalin had been eliminated from positions of power. Trotsky was in exile. Zinoviev and Kamenev had been publicly humiliated and forced to recant their positions. And Bukharin was in the process of being defeated on the question of economic policy. The key to Stalin's victory in this succession struggle was not charisma. It was not ideology. It was the general secretaryship and everything that went with it. He had spent 7 years filling every significant position in the party apparatus with people who owed their careers to him. When the vote counts mattered, when the Congress delegates were tallied, when the committee memberships were calculated, Stalin's people were in the majority, because Stalin had put them there. His rivals could make better speeches, write better theoretical articles, and inspire more genuine ideological enthusiasm. But Stalin controlled the machinery, and in a one-party state, the machinery is everything. This brings us to one of the most profound contrasts between Stalin and every other major dictator of the 20th century. Hitler did not maneuver. He performed. His rise to power was a public spectacle, a series of increasingly dramatic confrontations: the beer hall putsch, the trial, the prison sentence, the comeback, the electoral campaigns, the streets filled with marching brown shirts. Mussolini's march on Rome in 1922 was a piece of theatre, a bluff that the Italian establishment called by not calling it, handing power to a man who had threatened to take it by force but would have been stopped by any serious military resistance. These were men of public drama, men whose power depended on the performance of strength before an audience. Stalin's rise was invisible. It happened in meeting rooms and party congresses and personnel files. It happened through the accumulation of organizational debt, the patient building of networks that most of his brilliant rivals were too proud or too distracted to build. When Stalin finally revealed the full extent of his power, it was too late for anyone to stop it. By 1929, Stalin was the undisputed ruler of the Soviet Union, and he immediately embarked on the most radical transformation of a society since the French Revolution. The first 5-year plan, launched in 1928, aimed to industrialize the Soviet Union at a speed and scale that had never been attempted in human history. Steel production was to be multiplied several times over. Coal production was to soar. Entire new cities were to be built from nothing in the middle of the Siberian wilderness. Dnieper Dam, Magnitogorsk, Chelyabinsk, Novosibirsk. These were not expansions of existing industrial centers. They were brand new industrial complexes, built in years rather than decades, and they were built, in large part, by slave labor. The Gulag system, the network of forced labor camps spread across the Soviet Union, expanded dramatically under Stalin's industrialization drive, eventually holding somewhere between 15 and 18 million people at its peak, working under conditions of extreme privation in mines, timber camps, construction sites, and factories across the Soviet Union's vast territory. But here is what distinguishes Stalin from all the other dictators who built their power on coercion. The industrialization actually worked. Germany under Hitler experienced real economic growth, but much of it was driven by rearmament spending and later by the plunder of conquered territories. Italy under Mussolini saw significant infrastructure development, most famously the draining of the Pontine marshes and the building of the autostrade. But the Italian economy remained structurally weak and heavily dependent on agriculture. Stalin's Soviet Union, in the decade between 1929 and 1940, genuinely industrialized. Steel production increased from around 4 million tons in 1928 to over 18 million tons by 1940. Coal production nearly quadrupled. The Soviet Union went from being a predominantly agrarian economy to being the world's third or fourth largest industrial power in a single decade. This had a direct military consequence. When Germany invaded in 1941, the Soviet Union had the industrial capacity to produce weapons on a scale that eventually overwhelmed the Wehrmacht. The T-34 tanks, the Katyusha rockets, the Ilyushin ground attack aircraft, these were products of Stalinist industrialization, and they changed the course of the war. Hitler's Germany, for all its military genius at the tactical and operational level, was never able to match Soviet industrial production once the war shifted to a war of attrition. The price of this industrialization was catastrophic. The collectivization of Soviet agriculture, which ran parallel to the industrialization drive, was one of the greatest man-made disasters in human history. Stalin decided that the Soviet Union's millions of individual peasant farmers had to be consolidated into collective farms, kolkhozy, which would be more efficiently managed and whose surplus could be extracted by the state to fund industrial development. The peasants, naturally, did not want to surrender their land, their livestock, and their autonomy. The richer peasants, the so-called kulaks, were labelled class enemies and subjected to dekulakization, a process that involved mass arrest, deportation to Siberia, and execution on a scale of hundreds of thousands. Ordinary peasants who resisted collectivization were subject to the same treatment. The chaos of forced collectivization, combined with the state's insistence on extracting grain even when harvests failed, produced famine on a massive scale. The Holodomor in Ukraine between 1932 and 1933, a famine that killed somewhere between 3 and 7 million people, was not merely a product of mismanagement. It was, in significant part, the product of deliberate policy. The Soviet state continued to export grain while Ukrainians starved, continued to enforce grain requisitions even in regions where the population was dying of hunger, and continued to prevent starving peasants from leaving their villages to find food. The total death toll from famine, dekolakization, and forced labor in the collectivization period is estimated at somewhere between 6 and 12 million people. This raises the question that haunts every assessment of Stalin. Was he worse than Hitler? In terms of absolute numbers, the toll of Stalinism across the entire Soviet period is enormous, with credible estimates of deaths attributable to Stalin's policies ranging from 6 million to 20 million, depending on how you count and what you include. Hitler's regime killed approximately 6 million Jews in a deliberate, systematic genocide, as well as several million others in mass killings and extermination programs. Both were mass murderers on a scale that defies comprehension, but there are significant differences in the nature of the killing. Hitler's Holocaust was targeted on racial grounds, aiming at the complete elimination of entire ethnic and religious groups. Stalin's killing, while it included ethnic components, most notably in the deportations of entire peoples like the Chechens, the Crimean Tatars, the Volga Germans, and others during World War II, was primarily driven by class definitions, political categories, and above all, personal paranoia. Stalin did not kill primarily because he hated a particular group of people, though he was certainly capable of ethnic prejudice and anti-Semitism. He killed primarily because he feared losing power, and he came to believe that any person who was not absolutely loyal was a potential enemy, and that the only way to be sure was to eliminate the uncertain ones along with the certain ones. The logic was mathematical and terrifying. Better to kill 10 innocent people than to let one guilty one survive. This paranoia reached its absolute apex in the years 1936 to 1938 in the event known as the Great Purge, or the Great Terror. What happened in those years was something unprecedented in the history of any government anywhere. A state turned the full machinery of its secret police against itself, purging its own leadership, its own military command, its own party apparatus at every level, from village party secretaries to marshals of the army. The numbers are staggering. During 1937 and 1938 alone, the NKVD, the Soviet secret police under its chief Nikolai Yezhov, arrested approximately 1.5 million people. Of those, approximately 750,000 were executed. The rest were sent to the Gulag. And these were not random arrests. They targeted systematically and deliberately the most experienced, most capable, and most prominent members of Soviet society. Factory directors, engineers, military officers, party officials, scientists, writers, diplomats. The people arrested in the Great Terror were overwhelmingly people who had given their lives to building the Soviet state. They were shot in the basements of NKVD buildings or in forests on the outskirts of major cities, their bodies buried in mass graves that Soviet authorities would deny for decades, until the collapse of the Soviet Union allowed investigators to begin digging up places like Butovo and Kommunarka outside Moscow and Sandomok in Karelia. Whom did Stalin purge? Almost everyone who had ever been in a position to challenge his authority, even theoretically. Mikhail Tukhachevsky, the most brilliant military theorist in the Soviet army, a man who had advocated for mechanized warfare and deep operational theory that was decades ahead of most military thinking in the world, was arrested in May 1937, tortured until he signed a confession claiming to be a German agent, and shot in June 1937. He was 44 years old. Along with Tukhachevsky, the purge consumed 3 of the 5 Soviet marshals, 13 of 15 army commanders, 50 of 57 corps commanders, and 154 of 186 divisional commanders. By 1941, the Red Army had been decapitated. The officers who replaced the executed ones were younger, less experienced, and in many cases terrified to exercise any independent judgment because they had seen what happened to officers who made decisions that turned out to be wrong. The consequences of this military purge would become catastrophically apparent in the summer of 1941. Why did Stalin do it? This is the question that distinguished the Great Terror from anything that Hitler, Mussolini, or any other 20th century dictator did. Hitler purged his potential rivals too, most notably in the night of the Long Knives in June 1934 when the SA leadership was eliminated. But Hitler purged people he had identified as specific threats, specific power centers, specific ideological deviants. The scale was in the hundreds. Stalin's purge consumed hundreds of thousands, and it consumed people who were utterly, demonstrably loyal to him, people who had never shown the slightest sign of opposition, people who were, by any rational measure, among his most devoted servants. The answer historians have arrived at, with varying degrees of certainty, is that by 1936, Stalin's paranoia had reached a level where it was no longer susceptible to rational evidence. He had become convinced, genuinely convinced, that there was a vast conspiracy against him, that his regime was riddled with traitors in the pay of foreign powers, and that the only safety lay in systematic elimination of anyone who might possibly, under any circumstances, become a threat. The confessions extracted from the accused through sleep deprivation, physical torture, and threats against family members were self-reinforcing. Each confession named more names, producing more arrests, producing more confessions, in an expanding spiral that fed on itself. What is most chilling about the Great Terror from a historical perspective is how willing the accused were to denounce each other. Senior Bolsheviks who had given their entire adult lives to the revolution, who had fought in the Civil War, who had survived the underground years under the Tsar, who had built the Soviet state with their own hands, stood up in public show trials and confessed to monstrous crimes they had not committed, denounced colleagues and friends as traitors and saboteurs, and sometimes even begged for the privilege of being shot as an act of final service to the revolution. This phenomenon, which Arthur Koestler explored in his novel Darkness at Noon, published in 1940, has fascinated and horrified observers ever since. Part of the explanation is simple coercion. People confessed to protect family members who had been arrested or threatened. Part of it was the exhaustion and disorientation produced by weeks of interrogation without sleep. But part of it, for at least some of the accused, seems to have been a genuine perverse ideological commitment. If the party said they were guilty, then perhaps they were guilty in some deeper sense, even if they could not remember the specific crimes. This takes us to the secret police, the NKVD, which was perhaps the most important institution in Stalin's state, more important in many ways than the army or the Communist Party itself. The NKVD was responsible for internal security, border control, the Gulag system, political surveillance, foreign intelligence, and the conduct of the purges. Its chiefs were among the most powerful men in the Soviet Union, and they were also, almost invariably, among Stalin's most disposable servants. Genrikh Yagoda, who directed the NKVD during the early purge years, was himself arrested in 1936 and shot in 1938. Nikolai Yezhov, who replaced Yagoda and conducted the most intense period of the terror in 1937 and 1938, was arrested in 1939 and shot in 1940. Even Lavrenti Beria, who replaced Yezhov and would serve Stalin until the dictator's death in 1953, understood that his position was never entirely secure, that a single miscalculation, a single moment of perceived disloyalty, could send him to the same basement where he had sent so many others. This is the fundamental difference between Stalin's relationship with his subordinates and the relationship that any other major dictator of the era had with theirs. Hitler trusted Himmler, Goebbels, Goering, and others to a degree that allowed them genuine institutional independence. Stalin trusted no one. Not even the people who had helped him build his power. Not even the people who had saved his life. Not even the people who had worshipped him with the most abject devotion. Everyone, in the end, was potentially expendable. The Nazi-Soviet Pact, signed on August 23, 1939, is one of the most bewildering diplomatic documents in the history of the 20th century, and it illustrates another dimension in which Stalin operated as the polar opposite of every other major dictator. Hitler was ideologically consistent in ways that were ultimately self-destructive. He had stated in Mein Kampf that the Soviet Union was the primary enemy of German civilization, that Slavic peoples were racially inferior and destined for subjugation, and that the living space Germany needed was to be carved out of the Soviet East. This was not a negotiating position. It was a sincere belief, and yet, in August 1939, he signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union that allowed him to invade Poland without worrying about a two-front war. He did it because it was strategically necessary in the short term, and he intended to tear it up as soon as Poland and France had been dealt with. Stalin signed the same pact for different reasons and with different calculations. He had been trying, since at least 1934, to build a system of collective security in Europe that would constrain German aggression through alliances between the Soviet Union, France, and Britain. The Western powers, burned by the carnage of the First World War and deeply suspicious of Soviet communism, had proved unwilling to commit to a genuine military alliance with Moscow. The Munich Agreement of September 1938, in which Britain and France essentially handed Czechoslovakia's Sudetenland to Hitler in exchange for a worthless promise of no further territorial demands, convinced Stalin that the Western powers were either unable or unwilling to stop Hitler, and that they might even welcome a German attack on the Soviet Union as a way of eliminating both dangers at once. He decided, with characteristic, cold calculation, that if the Western powers were going to leave him exposed to German aggression, then he would buy himself time by making a deal with Germany himself, using the interval to strengthen Soviet defences and industrial capacity. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, named for the two foreign ministers who signed it, contained a secret protocol dividing Eastern Europe between the German and Soviet spheres of influence. The Soviet Union received eastern Poland, Finland, the Baltic states, and Bessarabia. Within weeks of the pact's signing, the Soviet Union occupied eastern Poland following the German invasion from the west, incorporated the Baltic states through a combination of military intimidation and rigged elections, launched a disastrous war against Finland that exposed the weakness of the Red Army in painful detail, and occupied Bessarabia from Romania. The Katyn massacre, in which approximately 22,000 Polish officers, intellectuals, police officers, and other members of the Polish elite were shot by the NKVD in the forests of western Russia in April and May 1940, was a direct consequence of the pact. Stalin ordered the elimination of the Polish officer class because he feared that educated patriotic Poles would become the nucleus of resistance to Soviet control. And he dealt with that fear in the way he always dealt with fears. He had the source of the fear killed. Meanwhile, the German war machine was demonstrating in Western Europe what it could do. Poland had fallen in 5 weeks. Denmark and Norway had been overrun. France, the great military power that had held Germany at bay for 4 years in the First World War, collapsed in 6 weeks in May and June 1940, an event that shocked the entire world, including Stalin. The fall of France changed everything, because it meant that Britain, fighting alone and in serious danger of defeat, was no longer in any position to check Germany from the west. The window that Stalin had bought with the pact had narrowed dramatically. He received intelligence from multiple sources, including his own superb spy networks, warning that Germany was planning to invade the Soviet Union. The intelligence was overwhelming and remarkably specific. Richard Sorge, the Soviet spy in Tokyo, reported the approximate date of the invasion. Soviet agents in Berlin, London and elsewhere confirmed the preparations. Even Winston Churchill sent personal warnings to Stalin. Stalin dismissed all of it as provocation, as misinformation designed to drag the Soviet Union into war prematurely, as panic-mongering by subordinates who lacked the courage and the political understanding to grasp the real situation. He was wrong. He was catastrophically, almost fatally wrong. On June 22, 1941, Operation Barbarossa began. It was the largest military operation in human history. 3.5 million German and Axis soldiers, supported by 3,000 tanks and 2,000 aircraft, crossed the Soviet border along a front stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. Within hours, the Soviet Air Force had lost over 1,000 aircraft, most of them destroyed on the ground before they could take off. Soviet border units were overwhelmed, surrounded, and destroyed. Army Group North drove toward Leningrad, Army Group Center drove toward Moscow, Army Group South drove toward Ukraine. The Soviet defenses collapsed with a speed that stunned even the German commanders, who had expected resistance. In the first 3 weeks, Germany captured approximately 750,000 Soviet prisoners of war. By the end of 1941, Germany held 3 million Soviet prisoners, most of whom would die in captivity, either from deliberate starvation or exposure in what constitutes a war crime of massive scale. And where was Stalin during all of this? This is perhaps the single most remarkable and least discussed episode in the entire story of the Second World War. In the immediate aftermath of Barbarossa, Josef Stalin, the absolute ruler of the Soviet Union, the most feared man on earth, vanished from public view. He did not address the nation. He did not appear before the military. He did not issue orders. He withdrew to his dacha at Kuntsevo outside Moscow, and for somewhere between 8 and 14 days, the exact duration is disputed among historians, he was essentially unreachable. Members of the Politburo who came to see him reported finding him in a state of shock, diminished, uncertain, apparently expecting to be arrested, perhaps even expecting to be killed. He told a small group of Politburo members who visited him that Lenin had left them a great state and they had lost it. These are not the words of a man in control. What had happened? The leading interpretation, supported by memoirs written after Stalin's death by people who were present, is that Stalin experienced something close to a psychological breakdown in the first days of Barbarossa. The invasion shattered the strategic framework that had organized his thinking for the previous 2 years. He had genuinely believed, that the Nazi-Soviet pact gave him time, that the Germans would not attack until they had dealt with Britain, that his own preparations and his own intelligence were sufficient to provide warning. The fact that he had been wrong, comprehensively and catastrophically wrong, on the most important strategic question of his era was apparently more than his psychological defenses could absorb immediately. He retreated into a kind of paralysis. This is the moment when Stalin most differs from every other wartime leader of the 20th century. Churchill, facing the fall of France and the threat of German invasion in 1940, delivered some of the most stirring speeches in the English language, rallied his nation, and personally dominated the machinery of war with energy and determination. Roosevelt, after Pearl Harbor in December 1941, appeared before Congress within 24 hours and gave a speech that mobilized an entire nation. Hitler, when his military position began to deteriorate in 1942, became, if anything, more obsessive, more controlling, more certain that his will could override military reality. Stalin, when Barbarossa hit, went to his dacha and appeared to wait for someone to arrest him. But then something happened that is equally remarkable. He came back. Sometime around June 30th, he began to function again. On July 3rd, he delivered his first radio address to the Soviet people since the invasion, a speech in which he addressed them as brothers and sisters, a departure from the usual communist formulations, and spoke with unmistakable gravity about the mortal danger facing the nation. The speech was not brilliant oratory in the Churchill mold. Stalin was never a great orator. But it was human in a way that surprised people who knew him, and it established the framework for what the Soviet Union would call the Great Patriotic War, drawing on Russian nationalist sentiment and the memory of previous invasions defeated by Russian endurance rather than purely communist ideology. It was a shrewd political move, but it also appears to have been sincere. Stalin understood that the Soviet Union needed something more than class consciousness to fight this war. It needed love of motherland, and he was willing to invoke that love even though it existed somewhat uneasily alongside the internationalist communist doctrine that was supposed to be the foundation of the Soviet state. The military situation continued to deteriorate catastrophically through the summer and fall of 1941. Leningrad was surrounded by September. Kiev fell in a catastrophic encirclement that captured over 600,000 Soviet troops in what remains the largest encirclement in military history. By October, the Germans were within 60 miles of Moscow. The Soviet government evacuated eastward to Kuibyshev. Foreign embassies left Moscow. Panic spread through the capital, with some residents fleeing eastward and others looting evacuated buildings. And Stalin stayed. This is one of the most consequential personal decisions of the entire war. Stalin decided not to leave Moscow, and his decision to stay sent a signal throughout the Soviet bureaucracy and military. If Stalin is still here, then Moscow has not fallen, and while Moscow has not fallen, the war continues. His mere presence in the city, confirmed by his appearance in the traditional parade at Red Square on November 7th, the anniversary of the October Revolution, with German artillery within earshot, had an enormous psychological effect on Soviet morale at one of its lowest points. The turning point came at Moscow in December 1941, when a Soviet counteroffensive threw the Germans back from the suburbs of the capital, ending any realistic German hope of winning the war through a single massive offensive. The counteroffensive was commanded by General Georgy Zhukov, who would become the greatest military figure produced by the Soviet Union in the war, and it was timed to coincide with the arrival of fresh divisions transferred from the Soviet Far East, where they had been stationed against a possible Japanese attack. The decision to move those divisions west, a decision taken in large part on the basis of intelligence from Richard Sorge in Tokyo, indicating that Japan intended to move south rather than north, was one of the shrewdest strategic decisions of the entire war. And it was Stalin's decision. This is the paradox at the heart of Stalin's wartime leadership, and it is a paradox that distinguishes him sharply from Hitler. Hitler, as the war progressed, became increasingly divorced from military reality, insisting on holding positions that could not be held, refusing to authorize retreats that would have saved divisions, making strategic decisions based on intuition and ideology rather than operational logic. His interference in military operations, which had occasionally produced brilliant results in the early campaigns by overriding the excessive caution of his generals, became progressively more destructive as the military situation deteriorated. Stalin made similar mistakes in the early war period, insisting on offensive actions that led to catastrophic encirclements, refusing to authorize withdrawals that could have saved armies. But he learned. This is the crucial difference. Stalin, unlike Hitler, was capable of updating his views in response to evidence. He was eventually willing to give Zhukov and other talented generals significant operational latitude, to step back from the moment-to-moment management of battles, to trust the military professional over the ideological calculation. Hitler never achieved this. His relationship with his generals became increasingly poisonous, a cycle of mutual contempt and distrust that contributed directly to German operational failures in the later years of the war. Stalin's relationship with his best generals evolved, imperfectly and sometimes violently, towards something that functioned, and that functioning made a difference. The Battle of Stalingrad, fought between August 1942 and February 1943, was the turning point of the war on the Eastern Front, and arguably of the entire Second World War. The German Sixth Army, under Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, became entrapped in an urban nightmare of street-by-street fighting in a city that bore Stalin's name, a coincidence that invested the battle with enormous symbolic significance on both sides. Stalin refused to evacuate the city that carried his name, feeding reinforcements across the Volga River under German air and artillery bombardment, maintaining a foothold on the western bank of the Volga through months of fighting that reduced the city to rubble. When Operation Uranus, the Soviet counteroffensive planned by Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky, encircled the German Sixth Army in November 1942, the result was the capture of over 300,000 German and Axis troops, including Field Marshal Paulus himself, the first German Field Marshal ever taken prisoner. It was the greatest German defeat of the war, and it marked the strategic turning point after which Germany was permanently on the defensive on the Eastern Front. Stalin's role in Stalingrad illustrates both his strengths and his limitations as a war leader. His insistence on holding the city, his willingness to feed unlimited reinforcements into the battle, his political control over a military situation that required unwavering nerve, all of these were essential to the Soviet victory. But he was also responsible for command decisions that prolonged the battle unnecessarily and cost Soviet lives that a more militarily sophisticated leadership might have saved. The officers who planned the actual victory, Zhukov and Vasilevsky, were military professionals who understood operational art at a level Stalin never quite reached. The partnership between the political absolute ruler and the military professionals, a partnership held together by Stalin's ability to terrorize and Zhukov's ability to deliver results, was deeply uncomfortable and occasionally catastrophic, but it ultimately worked in ways that the partnership between Hitler and his generals did not. The Allied conferences of the war years provide another remarkable contrast between Stalin and the other major leaders of the era. At Tehran in November and December 1943, Stalin met with Churchill and Roosevelt for the first time, and the encounter produced one of the most analyzed sets of personal interactions in diplomatic history. Roosevelt, eager to build a relationship with Stalin and convinced that he could charm him into a cooperative post-war arrangement, made the mistake of appearing to side with Stalin in several of the debates with Churchill. Stalin noticed this immediately and exploited it with ruthless precision, driving wedges between the two Western leaders on questions ranging from the timing of the Second Front in Western Europe to the post-war borders of Poland. Churchill, more experienced in dealing with difficult and dangerous men, saw Stalin more clearly, describing him privately as a man who combined enormous energy and a will to impose his ideas with deep realism about what was and was not achievable. Stalin's negotiating style was unlike anything the Western leaders had encountered. He was utterly without sentiment. He had no interest in being liked. He stated his demands clearly, listened to counter-arguments in silence, and then either accepted, rejected, or modified based on calculations of practical power, not personal relationship. Roosevelt's attempt to charm him failed completely, not because Stalin was hostile, but because charm was simply not a category that his mind recognized as relevant. The question of Poland was the central issue at Tehran and again at Yalta in February 1945, and it illustrates the nature of Stalinist foreign policy with particular clarity. Poland was the country over which Britain had gone to war in 1939. Churchill had a deep personal commitment to Polish independence and was under enormous political pressure from the Polish government in exile in London. Stalin wanted Poland within the Soviet sphere of influence, partly for strategic reasons. A friendly Poland was a buffer against future invasion from the West, and partly because Polish nationalism was a direct challenge to Soviet control of territories that had been part of the Russian Empire and that Stalin had occupied in 1939. His solution was characteristically brutal and effective. He installed a communist government in Poland. He had the leaders of the Polish Home Army, the underground resistance that had fought both Germans and Soviets, arrested when they came out of hiding to negotiate with Soviet representatives, and he confronted Roosevelt and Churchill with a fait accompli. The Soviet army occupied Poland, and there was nothing the Western powers could do about it, short of launching a war against the Soviet Union immediately after the conclusion of the war against Germany. Roosevelt and Churchill accommodated themselves to this reality because they had no practical alternative. The result was 45 years of Soviet domination of Poland and every other Eastern European country where the Red Army stood at the end of the war. Stalin's wartime leadership produced results that would have been considered miraculous if they had not been achieved at such horrifying cost. The Soviet Union, which had lost 3 to 4 million soldiers in the first 6 months of the war and had seen most of its major Western cities destroyed or occupied, produced a military machine that, by 1944, was arguably the most effective land army in the world. The Red Army that swept through Eastern Europe in 1944 and early 1945 was fundamentally different from the shattered, leaderless force that had reeled back before the German assault in 1941. It had developed combined arms tactics comparable to the best the Germans or Western allies could produce. It was equipped with excellent weapons. It was led by generals who had learned their trade in the harshest possible school. And it was animated by a combination of patriotic fury over German atrocities and genuine confidence in its own ability to win. Stalin's contribution to this transformation was not primarily operational. It was organizational and political. He managed the relationship between the military and the political sphere, he maintained the supply of resources and manpower to the front, he handled the diplomacy with the Allies, and he sustained the political will to fight at moments when a weaker ruler might have sought a negotiated peace. For all his failures and crimes, these were genuine achievements of leadership. The Soviet Union's human cost in the Second World War dwarfs the losses of any other combatant. Conservative estimates place total Soviet dead at around 27 million, a figure that includes approximately 8 to 9 million military deaths and approximately 18 to 19 million civilian deaths. To put this in perspective, the United States, the second largest loser among the major powers, lost approximately 405,000 dead. Britain lost approximately 450,000. Germany lost approximately 5 to 7 million. The Soviet Union lost more people in the Battle of Leningrad alone than the United States lost in the entire war. This scale of loss shaped Soviet society, Soviet politics, and Soviet foreign policy for generations, and it shaped Stalin's post-war behavior in ways that are impossible to understand, without grasping the magnitude of what the Soviet Union had experienced. The memory of Barbarossa, of the catastrophic surprise attack that had almost destroyed the state, became the organizing principle of Soviet foreign policy for the next 4 decades. The Soviet Union must never again be vulnerable, must never again allow potential enemies to stand on its borders, must create a buffer zone of subordinate states that would absorb any future attack before it reached Soviet territory. This strategic logic, however understandable in its origins, produced the Cold War. The occupation of Eastern Europe, the installation of communist governments in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, East Germany and the rest, the maintenance of Soviet troops on the soil of supposedly sovereign nations, the intimidation and eventually the elimination of non-communist political parties throughout the region, all of this flowed from the same paranoid defensive logic that had produced the Great Purge at home. Stalin could not distinguish between security and domination. A state that was subordinate to Soviet interests was a friendly state. A state that was genuinely independent was a potential threat. This was the logic of a man who had spent his entire life in a world where anyone who was not absolutely loyal was potentially a deadly enemy. The Berlin blockade of 1948 and 1949 was Stalin's most direct challenge to Western power in Europe in the immediate post-war period. When the Western Allies began moving toward creating a separate West German state with its own currency, Stalin ordered the land routes to West Berlin blockaded, attempting to starve the Western-controlled sectors of the city into submission and force the Western powers out of Berlin entirely. The Western response, the Berlin airlift that supplied the city by air for 11 months, was a successful demonstration of resolve that Stalin had not anticipated. He eventually lifted the blockade without having achieved his objective, one of the very few cases in which a direct confrontation between Stalin and the Western powers produced a clear Western victory. The episode illustrated another of Stalin's paradoxical characteristics. For all his willingness to commit mass murder against his own people, he was quite cautious in direct confrontations with the Western powers, particularly after the United States had demonstrated its atomic capability at Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. He was not suicidal. He was willing to use force and intimidation, but he generally stopped short of actions that risked direct military conflict with the Americans. The Soviet atomic bomb program, which produced its first successful test in August 1949, was one of the most consequential intelligence operations of the 20th century, accelerated significantly by Soviet espionage penetration of the American Manhattan Project. Klaus Fuchs, a British physicist who was a secret communist, passed detailed technical information to Soviet intelligence from within the Manhattan Project. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, American citizens, passed additional information. The Soviet program was directed by the physicist Igor Kurchatov, and Stalin monitored it with intense personal interest, regularly demanding updates from Beria, who oversaw the program, and demonstrating a sophisticated grasp of the technical questions involved that surprised some of the scientists who briefed him. When the Soviet bomb test succeeded in 1949, Stalin received the news with characteristic understatement and immediately ordered the continuation of the program toward a thermonuclear weapon. The Soviet nuclear program was, in retrospect, probably the single most important strategic achievement of the Stalin era, because it created the basis for the mutual deterrence framework that prevented the Cold War from becoming a hot one. The Korean War, which began in June 1950 when North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel and invaded South Korea, was another arena in which Stalin's hand was at work, though in a more indirect and cautious way than in Europe. Stalin had given Kim Il-sung his approval for the invasion, calculating that the United States would not intervene militarily in a conflict on the Asian mainland. He was wrong. The United States and a coalition of United Nations forces intervened within days, and what had looked like a quick communist victory in Korea became a 3-year war of attrition that ended essentially where it had begun. Stalin's role in Korea illustrates his calculated approach to risk. He supported North Korea materially and with advisors, and he allowed Soviet pilots to fly combat missions against American aircraft in some of the first jet-versus-jet aerial combat in history. But he did so secretly, using Chinese aircraft markings and forbidding Soviet pilots to fly west of a certain line where they might be captured, all to maintain plausible deniability and avoid a direct Soviet-American confrontation. He was willing to fight the Americans to the last Korean. The cult of personality that surrounded Stalin was, paradoxically, one of the most transparent frauds in the history of autocracy, and yet it was also one of the most effective. Every dictator builds a cult of personality. It is almost a definitional requirement of the totalitarian state. Hitler's cult was built around his claim to be the voice of the German folk, the embodiment of the German national spirit given human form. Mussolini's cult presented him as the reincarnation of Roman imperial greatness. Mao's cult, in its most extreme manifestation during the Cultural Revolution, elevated him to something approaching religious divinity, with the Little Red Book serving as a secular scripture. But Stalin's cult was different in a specific and important way. It was built around a false image that bore almost no resemblance to the actual man, and Stalin himself designed and maintained that false image with meticulous, deliberate craft. The Stalin of the cult was a warm, fatherly figure, the wise leader who guided his people with gentle wisdom, the brilliant military commander, the infallible theoretical mind, the friend of children and workers and poets. The actual Stalin was a cold, suspicious, often cruel man who trusted no one, showed affection rarely and strategically, and had a particular contempt for the intellectuals and artists whose creative work he nonetheless needed to serve the ideological purposes of the state. The falsification of historical photographs became one of the most emblematic practices of the Stalinist state. As successive figures were purged and eliminated, they were also literally erased from the historical record. Photographs were retouched, figures removed, histories rewritten, encyclopedias issued with supplementary pages to be inserted by readers in place of the pages describing now disgraced enemies of the people. Nikolai Yezhov, the NKVD chief who directed the Great Terror, appears in a famous photograph standing beside Stalin on a Moscow canal embankment. After Yezhov's own arrest and execution in 1940, Soviet censors airbrushed him out of the photograph, leaving Stalin alone on the embankment. The photograph, in its edited form, was reprinted in millions of copies of Soviet publications. When David King, a British photo researcher, spent decades tracking down original unretouched Soviet photographs in the 1970s and 1980s, he documented dozens of cases where figures had been systematically removed from historical images, producing a visual record of the purges that is at once darkly comic and profoundly disturbing. The cult of Stalin extended to the arts in ways that shaped an entire generation of Soviet culture. Socialist realism, the officially mandated aesthetic doctrine of the Soviet state, required that art depict reality in its revolutionary development, which in practice meant that painters painted heroic workers and peasants, writers wrote novels in which party members overcame obstacles through correct ideological thinking, and musicians were expected to produce accessible, uplifting compositions free of the kind of experimental difficulty that Stalin personally found incomprehensible and therefore threatening. Composers like Dmitri Shostakovich lived in a state of constant anxiety about whether their latest work would please or displease the man in the Kremlin. Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony, premiered in besieged Leningrad in 1942 and broadcast around the world as a symbol of Soviet resistance, was a genuine triumph of art under extreme circumstances, but Shostakovich himself never forgot that he worked under the shadow of a ruler who could have him arrested at any moment and who had in fact come very close to arresting him in 1936. After an editorial in Pravda denounced his opera Lady Macbeth of the Mtsensk district as muddle instead of music. The editorial, almost certainly written under Stalin's direction, sent a clear message to the entire Soviet artistic world. The aesthetic preferences of the leader were not matters of taste. They were matters of political loyalty. Boris Pasternak, the poet and novelist whose Dr. Zhivago would eventually be published in the West and win the Nobel Prize, had a famous telephone conversation with Stalin in the early 1930s about the arrested poet Osip Mandelstam. Mandelstam had written a poem mocking Stalin, a poem that began with a description of cockroach whiskers and fat fingers like worms, and someone had reported him. Stalin called Pasternak and asked him what the poets were saying about Mandelstam. The conversation, as Pasternak later described it, was one of the most surreal encounters in the history of literature. The most powerful man in the world, personally inquiring about the fate of a single poet, using an ordinary telephone call to make a decision about whether someone would live or die. Mandelstam survived that particular brush with death. He was arrested later, in 1938, and died in a transit camp near Vladivostok, allegedly of typhus and malnutrition, in December of that year. His poetry, which he had memorized because he knew it was too dangerous to write down, was preserved by his wife Nadezhda, who committed it to memory and lived long enough to recite it to scholars after Stalin's death. Stalin's private life was, in sharp contrast to his public image as the warm, fatherly leader, a study in emotional desert. He had been married twice. His first wife, Ekaterina Svanidze, whom he had married in 1906, died of typhus in 1907, leaving him with a son, Yakov. According to people who knew him, this death genuinely affected him, and his daughter Svetlana, born to his second wife, would later describe her father as saying that Kato's death had killed all his warm feelings toward people. Whether this is true or post hoc rationalization is impossible to know. His second wife, Nadezhda Alliluyeva, whom he married in 1919 when she was 16 years old and he was 39, died in November 1932. The official cause was appendicitis. The actual cause was a gunshot wound, and whether it was suicide or murder was never officially investigated, though the prevailing historical judgment is that she shot herself, possibly after a scene at a dinner party in the Kremlin, at which Stalin had been publicly rude or humiliating to her. Some accounts suggest she had written a letter to Stalin before her death criticizing the regime's policies. If she did, the letter was suppressed, and if Stalin read it, he gave no sign of being moved by it. He had 3 children who survived to adulthood. His son Yakov, from the first marriage, was captured by the Germans in 1941, and the Germans attempted to negotiate an exchange, Yakov for Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, who had been captured at Stalingrad. Stalin refused, allegedly saying that he did not trade field marshals for ordinary soldiers. Yakov died in the Sachsenhausen concentration camp in April 1943, reportedly throwing himself against the electric fence that surrounded the camp. His son Vasily, from the second marriage, was given a rapid and unearned career in the Soviet Air Force on the basis of his father's name, reached the rank of lieutenant general despite having demonstrated no particular military talent, and spent his life in a descent into alcoholism and mediocrity that his father simultaneously enabled and despised. His daughter Svetlana, the only one of his children who appears to have had a genuine relationship with him, remembered her father with a mixture of love and terror that she spent her entire life trying to reconcile. She defected to the West in 1967, writing 2 memoirs that provide some of the most intimate portraits of Stalin's private character available to historians. In 2011, she returned to Russia briefly but found the attention and scrutiny intolerable and returned to the West, dying in Wisconsin in 2011 at the age of 85. Stalin's attitudes toward Jews constitute one of the more complex aspects of his biography, because they evolved significantly over time and combine sincere ideological commitments with what appears to have been a deep personal prejudice. As a Marxist, he rejected racial categories as scientifically meaningless and ideologically bourgeois. The Soviet Union was officially and genuinely committed to equality among nationalities, and many of the most prominent figures in the early Bolshevik movement, including Trotsky, Zinoviev, Kamenev, and many others, were of Jewish origin. Stalin worked alongside these people for decades without, in most cases, allowing their ethnicity to determine his treatment of them, though his campaigns against Trotsky and others certainly drew on anti-Semitic tropes that circulated in Russian culture and that Stalin was perfectly willing to exploit when politically useful. But in his later years, particularly from the late 1940s onward, Stalin's anti-Semitism became increasingly overt and increasingly dangerous. The Soviet campaign against so-called rootless cosmopolitans, launched in 1948, was explicitly directed at Jewish intellectuals and was accompanied by the closure of Jewish cultural institutions, the arrest and eventual execution of members of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, including the great actor Solomon Michoels, who was murdered by the NKVD in January 1948 in a staged traffic accident, and a systematic purge of Jews from prominent positions in Soviet cultural, scientific, and political life. The culmination of this trend was the Doctors' Plot of 1952 and 1953, in which Stalin's security apparatus announced that a group of prominent Soviet doctors, most of them Jewish, had been arrested on charges of plotting to murder Soviet leaders. The announcement set off a wave of anti-Semitic hysteria across the Soviet Union, and many historians believe that Stalin was preparing, in the final months of his life, a pogrom on a massive scale, potentially including the mass deportation of Soviet Jews to Siberia that was only prevented by his death in March 1953. This brings us to the final chapter of Stalin's life, and to the most remarkable fact about it: he died in his bed. Consider the fates of the other major dictators of the 20th century. Hitler shot himself in a bunker in Berlin as Soviet troops fought their way through the streets above him. Mussolini was captured by Italian partisans and shot, his body hung upside down from a gas station forecourt in Milan. Tojo, the Japanese prime minister who had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor, attempted suicide and failed, then was tried and hanged. Ceausescu of Romania was executed by firing squad. Gaddafi of Libya was captured and beaten to death by a mob. The pattern is almost universal. Dictators who come to violent power tend to come to violent ends. Stalin is the extraordinary exception. He died on March 5, 1953, of a stroke in his dacha at Kuntsevo, having apparently collapsed in the small hours of the previous morning and lain on the floor for hours before anyone dared to check on him, because everyone was so terrified of disturbing him without permission. The circumstances of Stalin's final hours are themselves a parable of his entire system. He had been seen by aides on the night of March 1st, and when the usual sign that he had gone to bed did not appear in the early hours of March 2nd, no one dared to go in and check on him. His bodyguards were afraid, his staff were afraid. The members of the inner circle, Beria, Malenkov, Khrushchev, Bulganin, who had gathered at his dacha the previous evening and had dined and drunk with him as he had watched a film in the dacha screening room, were afraid. They had spent their entire careers afraid of this man, and the habit of fear was so deeply ingrained that even the possibility that something was seriously wrong could not overcome it immediately. Eventually, in the late afternoon of March 2nd, a young officer was sent in to check. He found Stalin lying on the floor in a pool of urine, conscious but unable to speak or move. The doctors were summoned, though the process of summoning them and getting them to come was itself delayed by the paralysis of everyone involved. Stalin lingered for 3 more days, and the 4 members of the inner circle who gathered at his bedside alternated between expressions of concern and, according to Khrushchev's later account, barely concealed relief. Beria, in particular, appears to have greeted each sign of weakness in Stalin with something like satisfaction, and to have returned to expressions of anguish whenever the dying man appeared to rally. Khrushchev would later write that Beria was visibly happy when Stalin stopped showing signs of consciousness, and that when Stalin unexpectedly opened his eyes and seemed to look around the room, Beria immediately fell to his knees and began kissing his hand. This detail, whether precisely accurate or somewhat embellished in the retelling, captures something essential about the nature of power under Stalin. It was a system built on the performance of devotion toward a man who inspired genuine terror, and that performance continued even as the man was dying. Stalin died at 9:50 p.m. on March 5, 1953. He was 74 years old. The announcement of his death was not made to the Soviet public until the following morning, the hours in between being consumed by the scramble for power among the members of the inner circle. The public reaction, when it came, was extraordinary in its intensity. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet citizens attempted to file past his body as it lay in state in the House of Trade Unions in Moscow. In the crush of people attempting to reach the building on the first day, hundreds were trampled to death, another grotesque footnote to the career of a man whose rule had been punctuated by mass death from beginning to end. The power struggle that followed Stalin's death was immediate, dangerous, and settled faster than anyone expected. The initial arrangement placed Malenkov as Prime Minister and First Secretary of the party, with Beria controlling the security apparatus and Khrushchev and Molotov in supporting roles. Within weeks, it became clear that Beria, who moved quickly and boldly to assert control, understood the situation most clearly and was moving most decisively. He proposed the release of political prisoners, the relaxation of controls over satellite states, and the reunification of Germany as a neutral state, all positions that might have been sensible if proposed by anyone other than the man who had run the Soviet secret police for 15 years and was known to have accumulated files on every significant figure in Soviet public life. His colleagues were terrified of him, and they responded to terror in the way Stalin had trained them to respond to terror. They eliminated the source of it. In June 1953, at a meeting of the Presidium, Beria was arrested on the motion of Khrushchev with Malenkov's support in an operation that apparently involved the personal participation of military officers who had been pre-briefed by Khrushchev. Beria was tried, convicted of treason, and shot in December 1953. The man who had personally supervised the execution of thousands of people, who had conducted many interrogations personally, and with evident relish, who had raped or seduced dozens of women using the power of his position, was led to a basement and shot in the back of the head, the same death he had ordered for so many others. The struggle continued at lower intensity between Khrushchev and Malenkov through 1954 and into 1955. With Khrushchev gradually accumulating enough institutional support to force Malenkov's demotion. By 1955, Khrushchev was the dominant figure in the Soviet leadership, though he did not achieve the kind of absolute personal power that Stalin had wielded. The Soviet system had been so traumatized by the Stalin years that none of the surviving leaders had any interest in recreating the conditions under which a single individual could order the arrest and execution of any other individual at will. They had all survived those conditions, and survival had taught them what the conditions felt like from the inside. Nikita Khrushchev's secret speech, delivered to the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union on February 25, 1956, is one of the most extraordinary documents in the history of the 20th century. For 4 hours behind closed doors, Khrushchev addressed the assembled party delegates and described, in unprecedented detail, the crimes of the Stalin era. The arbitrary arrests, the torture, the forced confessions, the execution of loyal party members, the destruction of the military leadership on the eve of war, the refusal to heed warnings of the German invasion, the cult of personality, the falsification of history. He described Stalin as having been guilty of grave abuse of power, of having murdered innocent people, of having created a climate of fear and suspicion that had corrupted the entire Soviet system. This was not, it should be noted, a comprehensive indictment. Khrushchev said nothing about the Gulag, nothing about the Holodomor, nothing about the deportation of entire peoples, nothing about the systematic repression of religion, nothing about the millions of deaths attributable to collectivization. He focused primarily on the destruction of party members and military officers, the people whose deaths had directly affected the audience he was addressing. But even in its limited form, the speech was shattering. The speech was supposed to be secret, but it was not. Copies were circulated to foreign communist parties, and within weeks the CIA had obtained a copy through Israeli intelligence, which had received it through the Polish United Workers' Party. The speech was published in the New York Times in June 1956. Its contents became known throughout the communist world, and its effects were immediate and seismic. In Poland, workers went on strike in June 1956 in what became known as the Poznan protests. In Hungary, a full-scale revolution erupted in October 1956, with Soviet troops fighting Hungarian civilians in the streets of Budapest before crushing the uprising in November. In the international communist movement, Khrushchev's speech produced a crisis of faith, from which the movement never fully recovered. If Stalin had been what Khrushchev said he was, what did that mean about the system that had elevated and sustained him? The de-Stalinization process that Khrushchev initiated was real but incomplete. Stalin's body was removed from the Lenin Mausoleum in Red Square, where it had been displayed alongside Lenin since 1953, and reburied near the Kremlin Wall in 1961. Stalingrad was renamed Volgograd. Portraits were removed, statues were demolished, and the most egregious falsifications of the Stalin era began to be corrected. But the Gulag was not fully disclosed. The full scale of the purges was not revealed. The records remained classified. The process of genuine historical reckoning was limited by the fact that too many people who had participated in the crimes were still alive and still in positions of power, and by the ideological necessity of maintaining the legitimacy of the Communist Party itself, which could not survive an honest accounting of what it had done to the Soviet people. The reassessment of Stalin in Russia has swung back and forth since Khrushchev's speech, and it continues today. In the Soviet period, a partial rehabilitation began under Brezhnev, who quietly restored some of Stalin's reputation as a wartime leader while not returning to full-scale Stalinist adulation. After the Soviet collapse, a period of more open historical inquiry produced a body of scholarship, partly by Russian historians with access to newly opened archives, that documented the Stalin era with unprecedented precision. The exact numbers of people shot, the contents of the orders that authorized mass operations, the administrative mechanisms of the terror, the demographic consequences of collectivization. But in the 2000s and into the 2010s, public opinion polls in Russia began showing increasing numbers of Russians who viewed Stalin positively, citing his wartime leadership, the industrial achievements of his era, and a general nostalgia for the perceived strength and order of the Soviet period. By 2021, polls showed that more than half of Russians held a favorable view of Stalin, the highest proportion since the Soviet period itself. This rehabilitation is, for obvious reasons, deeply disturbing to historians, to the relatives of the millions who died in the terror and famine, and to the people of former Soviet satellite states who have their own, much clearer memories of what Soviet rule meant in practice. Among the men who surrounded Stalin throughout his years at the peak of power, none was more curious, more durable, or more representative of the Stalinist system than Vyacheslav Molotov. Born Vyacheslav Mikhailovich Skryabin in 1890, Molotov had been a Bolshevik since his student years, had known Lenin personally, and had survived every purge of the Stalin era, not through brilliance or military success, but through a quality that Stalin valued above all others in a subordinate: total, unwavering, unquestioning compliance. Molotov was the Soviet foreign minister from 1939 to 1949. The man who signed the non-aggression pact with Ribbentrop, the man whose name became part of the term Molotov cocktail when Finnish soldiers gave the incendiary devices they used against Soviet tanks, that dark nickname during the Winter War. He attended every major wartime conference, met with Churchill and Roosevelt, represented Soviet interests at the founding of the United Nations in San Francisco in 1945. He was one of the most recognizable faces of the Soviet state to the outside world for a decade and a half, and yet Stalin had Molotov's wife arrested in 1948. Polina Jemchuzhina, a senior Soviet official in her own right and a member of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, was accused of connections to Jewish nationalists and exiled to Siberia. Molotov, at the meeting of the Politburo at which his wife was denounced, abstained from the vote on her expulsion from the party rather than voting against it, and Stalin never forgave him for even that minimal gesture of disloyalty. Molotov and Jemchuzhina were forbidden from any contact throughout her imprisonment. Molotov was removed from the foreign ministry in 1949 and, by some accounts, was preparing to face arrest himself when Stalin died in 1953. Stalin had apparently decided that even Molotov, his most loyal lieutenant of 30 years, was no longer trustworthy enough to keep alive. Polina was released from exile after Stalin's death and reunited with her husband. Molotov lived until 1986, dying at the age of 96, the last surviving member of the original Bolshevik leadership, insisting until the end of his life that Stalin had been a great leader who made certain mistakes, but that the fundamental direction of his policies had been correct. The relationship between Stalin and Josip Broz Tito, the Yugoslav communist leader who had led a successful partisan resistance against the German occupation, is one of the most dramatic episodes in the history of Soviet foreign policy and offers yet another window into Stalin's fundamental inability to tolerate independence in anyone who was supposed to be subordinate to him. Tito had come to power in Yugoslavia through his own efforts, without the Red Army delivering his country to him as it had delivered Poland, Romania, Hungary, and the others. He had built his own partisan movement, fought his own war, and emerged in 1945 as the most genuinely popular communist leader in Eastern Europe, a man with real legitimacy that did not derive from Moscow. This made him, in Stalin's mind, potentially the most dangerous communist in Europe, a figure who could inspire other communist parties to seek similar independence, who could demonstrate that communism was possible without Soviet domination. The Tito-Stalin split of 1948 began over seemingly minor organizational disputes. Soviet advisors in Yugoslavia, the behavior of Soviet intelligence agents on Yugoslav soil, Yugoslavia's attempts to form a Balkan federation with Bulgaria without Moscow's approval. But it quickly escalated into a comprehensive break, with Stalin expelling Yugoslavia from the Communist Information Bureau, the Cominform, in June 1948, denouncing Tito and the Yugoslav leadership as traitors to Marxism-Leninism, and apparently making plans to assassinate Tito personally. According to a story that circulates in various forms among historians, Tito sent Stalin a private message at some point during the dispute that read, "Stop sending people to kill me. We've already caught 5 of them, one with a bomb and another with a rifle. If you don't stop sending killers, I'll send a very fast-working one to Moscow, and I certainly won't have to send another." Stalin, who was supposedly amused by this message, allegedly said that it was a good telegram. Whether this story is entirely accurate or partially embellished, it captures something true about Tito's relationship with Stalin and about the limits of Stalin's reach. Yugoslavia remained independent of Moscow throughout the Cold War, and Tito lived until 1980, dying peacefully in Ljubljana at the age of 87, having never been assassinated despite Stalin's best efforts. The contrast with the leaders of other Eastern European communist parties is stark. In Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Albania, local communists who showed any sign of independence or nationalism were arrested, tortured, put on show trial, and sometimes executed in a series of purges that consciously replicated the model of the 1936 to 1938 terror in the Soviet Union. Laszlo Rach in Hungary was hanged in 1949. Trysho Kostov in Bulgaria was hanged in 1949. Rudolf Slansky in Czechoslovakia was hanged in 1952. These men had been loyal communists, some of them since the 1920s. They had survived the underground years, the German occupation, the war. They were killed not because they had done anything wrong by the standards of their own ideology, but because Moscow had decided they represented a potential alternative source of loyalty that might, under some hypothetical future circumstances, challenge Soviet control. The logic was pure Stalinism. Eliminate the potential threat before it becomes an actual one. The Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe produced a social and economic experiment that ran for 45 years, long enough to affect the development of entire generations and to reshape the physical landscape of an entire continent. In East Germany, the Soviet-backed state destroyed the middle class that had survived the war, collectivized agriculture, nationalized industry, and attempted to build a new socialist society from the ruins of the Nazi one. The result was a brain drain of 3 million people who fled west before the Berlin Wall was built in August 1961, followed by the economic stagnation of a country that had been one of the most industrially advanced in the world, reduced to permanent economic inferiority relative to its Western neighbor. In Poland, the Soviet system destroyed the economic and social structures that had been built between the wars and imposed a command economy that generated some industrial growth but could never compete with Western living standards. In Hungary, the brief experiment in reformed communism under Imre Nagy in 1956 was crushed by Soviet tanks in November of that year, with between 3,000 and 15,000 Hungarians killed in the fighting and approximately 200,000 fleeing as refugees to the west. The repression that followed under the Soviet-installed János Kadar lasted for years, and all of this traced back ultimately to the decisions made by the small, pockmarked Georgians sitting in the Kremlin. Every Eastern European show trial, every Soviet tank rolling through the streets of Budapest, every political prisoner in every East European jail was, in some direct or indirect sense, a consequence of the system that Stalin had built and the priorities he had established. The Cold War was not, as some early Western analyses suggested, the product of Soviet expansionism alone, nor, as some later revisionist analyses argued, primarily the product of American overreaction. It was a genuine confrontation between two incompatible visions of the post-war world and Stalin's vision, shaped by the paranoid logic of a man who had spent his entire life eliminating threats before they materialized, made genuine coexistence extraordinarily difficult. He could not accept the existence of a Europe that was not dominated by either Germany or the Soviet Union. And since Germany had been decisively defeated, the logic of the situation, as Stalin read it, required Soviet domination. That this domination would generate precisely the kind of hostile coalition it was designed to prevent was a consequence of his system's logic that he could not fully perceive from within it. The Zhdanov doctrine, named for Andrei Zhdanov, one of Stalin's closest lieutenants in the immediate post-war years, represented the ideological framework of the Soviet Cold War position. Announced at the founding conference of the Cominform in September 1947, the doctrine divided the world into two irreconcilable camps: the imperialist camp led by the United States and the anti-imperialist democratic camp led by the Soviet Union. This framework explicitly rejected the possibility of any third way, any genuinely neutral or independent position, any form of mixed economy or social democracy that might offer an alternative to the binary choice between American capitalism and Soviet communism. The doctrine's rigidity reflected Stalin's own intellectual style. He thought in binaries, in friend or enemy, in loyal or treasonous, in the party line or deviation from it. Nuance, complexity, and ambiguity were not categories his mind naturally accommodated. They were categories it treated as threats. Andrei Zhdanov himself, who might have been Stalin's preferred successor, died in August 1948 under circumstances that remain somewhat unclear, officially from heart disease, though the doctor's plot accusations of 1953 would claim that his physicians had deliberately given him incorrect treatment. After Zhdanov's death, his faction within the Soviet leadership, sometimes called the Leningrad Group because many of its members had been associated with the Leningrad Party organization, was systematically destroyed in what became known as the Leningrad Affair. Alexei Kuznetsov, Nikolai Voznesensky, and dozens of other senior officials associated with Zhdanov were arrested in 1949 and 1950, tried in secret, and shot in 1950. The charge, as with all late Stalinist purges, was essentially treason. They were accused of attempting to create a separate Russian Communist Party that would challenge the All-Union Party's authority, and of maintaining contacts with foreign intelligence services. The accusations were almost certainly false. The real motivation was, as usual, Stalin's preemptive elimination of people who might, in some future configuration of power, represent an alternative. The Leningrad Affair was organized primarily by Georgy Malenkov and Lavrentiy Beria, who saw the Leningrad Group as rivals and used Stalin's paranoia as the instrument of their elimination. This pattern of members of the inner circle using Stalin's suspiciousness as a weapon against each other was characteristic of the late Stalin period. Stalin was aging, increasingly erratic, increasingly drunk on the power he had accumulated over decades, and the members of his inner circle had become expert at navigating his moods, at knowing when to bring him information that would trigger a purge of a rival and when to suppress information that might make him suspicious of themselves. The politics of the Stalin inner circle in the years 1948 to 1953 were those of a court around a dangerous, unpredictable, aging tyrant. Extremely high stakes, intensely personal, and conducted in the shadow of constant mortal danger. One of the most revealing windows into Stalin's character in his final years is provided by the account of his late-night dinners, the marathon sessions that he conducted almost nightly at his dacha in Kuntsevo, to which members of the inner circle were summoned and from which they could not easily escape. These dinners typically began late in the evening and lasted until the small hours of the morning, with Stalin controlling the conversation, the films watched afterward in the dacha's screening room, and the amount of alcohol consumed. He ate prodigiously and drank in a way that demonstrated impressive tolerance. Georgian wine flowed in enormous quantities, and there was vodka for those who preferred it. Members of the inner circle who were invited were expected to eat and drink whatever Stalin put before them, to stay as long as he wanted to stay, and to leave only when he released them. The fatigue this produced in men who had full-time jobs running a superpower was significant, but nobody complained. Nobody dared to complain. At these dinners, Stalin read, discussed, and argued about history, military strategy, economics, art, and cinema. He was a voracious reader throughout his life, consuming enormous quantities of books and annotating his copies densely in the margins. His personal library, preserved in the Russian state archives, contains thousands of volumes with his handwritten comments, covering an extraordinary range of subjects from military history to philosophy to poetry. The comments reveal a mind that was genuinely analytical, often penetrating and sometimes wrong in ways that reveal characteristic blind spots. He had strong aesthetic opinions. He admired the historical novels of Alexei Tolstoy, enjoyed John Ford westerns, was less enthusiastic about abstract or experimental art, which he consistently associated with bourgeois decadence. He spoke Georgian as his first language and Russian as a second language, never fully mastering the Russian literary tradition's most difficult registers, and he tended to respect intellectual achievements he could not match himself with a mixture of admiration and suspicion. The question of Stalin's anti-Semitism in its final and most dangerous form leads directly to one of the most contested questions in late Soviet history. Whether Stalin was planning in early 1953 a final comprehensive purge that would have included the mass deportation of Soviet Jews to Siberia and Central Asia. The evidence for this hypothesis is circumstantial but significant. The Doctor's Plot announcement in January 1953 set off a wave of anti-Semitic persecution that went far beyond the arrest of the named physicians. Jews were fired from their jobs throughout the Soviet Union, Jewish newspapers and cultural institutions received threatening correspondence, and some accounts describe preparation of railway cars and construction of new camps in the East. Khrushchev, in his memoirs, describes Stalin saying in the period before his death that the Soviet Union had too many Jews in responsible positions. Survivors of the period describe an atmosphere of genuine terror among Soviet Jews in the winter of 1952 to 1953 that was qualitatively different from the discrimination they had experienced earlier. The counterfactual, what would have happened if Stalin had lived another year or two, is one of the more disturbing exercises in historical imagination. The Doctor's Plot had the shape and structure of a prepared campaign. The denunciations, the arrests, the media campaign, the targeting of specific individuals. Whether it would have culminated in deportations on the scale of those visited on the Chechens or the Volga Germans or other deported peoples, and whether those deportations would have been accompanied by mass killings, will never be known. What stopped it was Stalin's stroke. Within days of Stalin's death, the surviving doctors were released. The Doctor's Plot was declared a fabrication. The anti-Jewish campaign collapsed almost immediately, not because any of the men who took power after Stalin were Philo-Semites, but because they understood that the campaign had been heading towards something that even they, hardened veterans of the Stalin years, found alarming, and that none of them wanted to preside over. The physical condition of the Soviet Union at the end of the Stalin era was in many ways remarkable in its contradictions. The country had nuclear weapons and was building intercontinental bombers and submarines capable of projecting military power globally. It had heavy industry, steel production, coal mining, oil extraction on a scale that ranked it among the world's major industrial economies. It was launching the first tentative steps of the space program that would put the first satellite and the first human into orbit in 1957 and 1961. At the same time, ordinary Soviet citizens lived in conditions of genuine poverty by Western standards, with housing shortages, consumer goods scarcity, food quality that was frequently poor, and political restrictions on movement, speech, publication, and association that would have been considered intolerable in any democratic country. The gap between the power of the Soviet state and the welfare of Soviet citizens was not a gap that Stalin found troubling, because the welfare of Soviet citizens as individuals had never been the goal. The goal was the power of the state, measured in steel production and military capability, and by that measure, the achievement was real. The cost, in human lives and human flourishing, was incalculable. The Stalin era left the Soviet Union with a set of institutional pathologies that ultimately proved fatal to the system. The habit of concealment, of never reporting bad news upward because the bearer of bad news might be arrested, produced systematic information failure throughout the Soviet bureaucracy. Factory managers reported production figures that met their quotas regardless of actual production. Agricultural officials reported harvests that satisfied the plan regardless of what had actually been harvested. Military commanders reported readiness levels that satisfied their superiors regardless of actual preparedness. And Stalin, who knew intellectually that everyone around him lied to him, responded not by creating institutional mechanisms to get accurate information, but by expanding the surveillance and punishment apparatus that was supposed to ensure honesty, but instead ensured that the dishonesty simply became more sophisticated. The result was a system that functioned, often quite effectively, at the macro level while rotting at every individual level. A system whose aggregate statistics looked impressive while its individual components were often dysfunctional. This information pathology was not, it should be said, unique to the Soviet Union or to Stalinist systems. It appears in every system where the consequences of delivering bad news are severe, and it was present in Hitler's Germany as well, where subordinates routinely told the Führer what he wanted to hear, rather than what was actually happening on the front. But it was more systematic and more pervasive in the Soviet case because the penalties for honesty were more consistently applied, and because the culture of deception had been cultivated for longer and more deliberately. The Soviet bureaucracy had been schooled in dishonesty for 3 decades by the time Stalin died, and the habit did not vanish with him. It persisted through the entire Soviet period, contributing to the failure of central planning, the dysfunctions of the command economy, and ultimately to the information vacuum in which Gorbachev's reforms operated in the 1980s. The relationship between Stalin and Mao Zedong, who came to power in China in October 1949, was one of the defining geopolitical relationships of the early Cold War, and it illustrates Stalin's capacities and limitations in foreign policy with particular clarity. Stalin had been deeply skeptical of the Chinese communists for most of the 1940s, consistently advising Mao to seek accommodation with Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government rather than pressing for outright communist victory, in part because he calculated that an American-backed nationalist China was less threatening to Soviet interests than a strong, independent communist China that might develop its own power base and challenge Soviet leadership of the international communist movement. He was, in other words, applying the same logic that had produced the Tito split to the Chinese situation. He preferred a weak, controllable ally to a strong, independent one. When Mao won, despite Stalin's advice, winning the Civil War and proclaiming the People's Republic of China in October 1949, the relationship between the two leaders required careful management. Mao visited Moscow in December 1949 for a stay of several weeks, negotiating the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship, Alliance, and Mutual Assistance signed in February 1950. The negotiations were difficult, partly because Stalin was in no hurry to treat Mao as an equal and deliberately kept him waiting, partly because the economic terms Stalin offered were less generous than Mao had hoped for, and partly because the two men's personalities were simply ill-matched. Mao was himself accustomed to total deference and found Stalin's condescension difficult to absorb. The treaty that emerged was a real alliance, but it was an unequal one, and Mao remembered the way Stalin had treated him. After Stalin's death in 1953, Mao would gradually position himself as the genuine theoretical heir to Leninist Marxism against what he portrayed as Khrushchev's revisionism, and the Sino-Soviet split of the early 1960s would shatter the unity of the international communist movement permanently, with consequences that shaped global geopolitics for the rest of the Cold War. The Soviet victory parade of June 24, 1945, staged in Moscow's Red Square, exactly 5 years after Germany had launched Operation Barbarossa, was one of the most spectacular military displays of the 20th century. Soviet soldiers marched in precise formation past the Lenin Mausoleum, where Stalin stood watching, and 200 captured German military standards were thrown at the base of the mausoleum in a gesture of deliberate, choreographed humiliation of the enemy. Marshal Zhukov, the greatest Soviet military commander of the war, rode a white horse in an echo of historical imagery of military triumph to accept the parade. It was Zhukov's moment of supreme glory. And it was, predictably, the moment at which Stalin began systematically to reduce Zhukov's prominence. Within months, Zhukov was demoted from his position as commander of Soviet ground forces and transferred to command of the Odessa military district, a backwater posting. He was later accused in a Security Ministry investigation of planning a military coup, a charge that was not pressed to its logical conclusion only because Zhukov was too popular with the military to arrest safely. He was left in his relative obscurity, the hero of the greatest war in history, reduced to provincial military command until Stalin's death freed him. The fate of Georgy Zhukov illustrates a principle that runs through Stalin's entire treatment of capable and popular subordinates. He needed them while the crisis lasted, and he moved against them as soon as the crisis was resolved. He had needed Zhukov to win the war, and he had given Zhukov enough latitude to do so at the cost of suppressing his personal jealousy and insecurity for the duration. Once the war was won, the same qualities that had made Zhukov indispensable, His genuine military genius, his personal courage, his enormous popularity with the troops made him politically threatening. And politically threatening figures had a well-established trajectory in the Stalin system. Zhukov was lucky. He survived. Many who were less famous, less popular, and less militarily distinguished did not. The camps of the Gulag system, which reached their maximum size in the years immediately after the war, were filled in that period with a new category of prisoner that had barely existed before 1941. Soviet citizens who had experienced the outside world, soldiers who had fought their way to Germany and seen Western Europe, diplomats and officials who had served abroad, repatriated prisoners of war who had spent years in German camps, all were objects of intense suspicion in the post-war Soviet system. Any contact with the outside world was presumed contaminating. Any person who had seen that other countries organized their societies differently was a potential source of dangerous comparison. Soldiers who returned from Germany and Austria described to family and friends the standard of living they had seen there, the consumer goods, the housing, the food, and this informal spreading of information was treated as a security threat. The repatriated prisoners of war were particularly suspect. Those who had not actively collaborated with the Germans had nonetheless survived in German captivity, when the correct ideological response to capture might have been to die rather than fall into enemy hands. Approximately 1.8 million Soviet POWs returned from German captivity, and of these a significant number were arrested, sent to the Gulag, or subjected to other forms of punishment for the crime of having been captured. The immediate post-war period also saw the consolidation of Stalin's control over Soviet science in ways that had long-term consequences for Soviet scientific development. The Lysenko affair, named for Trofim Lysenko, a Ukrainian agronomist who had rejected Mendelian genetics in favor of a neo-Lamarckian theory of acquired characteristics that had no scientific basis but aligned with certain Marxist notions about the malleability of nature, is one of the most extraordinary episodes of ideologically directed anti-science in the history of any country. Lysenko's theories, which claimed that plants could pass on characteristics acquired during their lifetime to their offspring, had been formally endorsed by Stalin as consistent with Marxist-Leninist philosophy, and in August 1948, an official decree of the Academy of Agricultural Sciences declared classical genetics a bourgeois pseudoscience. Soviet geneticists were arrested, fired, or forced to recant their scientific work. Research programs based on Mendelian genetics were shut down. The Soviet Union, which had been home to some of the world's most advanced biological research in the 1920s and early 1930s, effectively removed itself from one of the most productive fields in 20th century science at exactly the moment when the structure of DNA was being worked out in Cambridge and the foundations of modern molecular biology were being laid in Western laboratories. The consequences were felt for decades. Soviet agriculture suffered because the application of Lysenkoist ideas to actual crop breeding produced predictably poor results. Soviet biology lagged behind Western biology for an entire generation, and the principle that political authority could override scientific evidence, established so dramatically in the Lysenko affair, persisted in various forms throughout the Soviet period, contributing to decisions in nuclear safety, chemical usage, and environmental policy that produced some of the worst ecological disasters of the 20th century. The Chernobyl nuclear disaster of 1986 was not directly caused by Lysenkoism, but it was produced by a culture of institutional concealment and bureaucratic falsification that Stalinism had cultivated and that the Soviet system had never been able to overcome. The deportations of entire Soviet peoples during and after the Second World War represent another dimension of Stalinist criminality that distinguishes him even from the other dictators of his era in the sheer ethnic breadth of his targeting. Between 1941 and 1949, entire ethnic groups were forcibly removed from their homelands and transported to Central Asia and Siberia. The Volga Germans, descendants of settlers who had lived on the Volga since Catherine the Great's time, were deported in September 1941 on the grounds that they might be a fifth column for the German invaders. The Chechens and Ingush were deported in February 1944, on the same grounds, in a mass operation of extraordinary brutality. The entire population of approximately 400,000 people was loaded onto cattle cars in winter conditions with minimal food or water and transported to Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. Between a quarter and a third of the deportees died during the transport or in the first years of exile. The Crimean Tatars, the Balkars, the Karachais, the Meskhetian Turks, all were subjected to the same treatment in the same period. The official justification in each case was collective punishment for alleged collaboration with the German enemy. The real motivation was almost certainly simpler. Stalin distrusted peoples with strong national identities that might challenge Soviet authority, and deportation was his solution to that distrust. What does it mean to call Stalin the opposite of every other dictator? It means, first, that he was a man of organizational rather than charismatic power. He built his position not on the performance of strength, but on the patient accumulation of institutional control. He was not loved in the way that Hitler was genuinely loved by a significant portion of the German population in the late 1930s. He was feared, and the cult of love around him was constructed and maintained by a propaganda apparatus that he controlled, not by genuine popular sentiment. Second, it means that he was a man who operated through concealment rather than display. Other dictators marched in parades, gave speeches, staged spectacles of power. Stalin worked in private, appeared in public rarely and briefly, and maintained his power not through the performed display of strength, but through the hidden machinery of terror. Third, it means that he survived, when all the others did not. The explanation for his survival is partly that he faced different circumstances than Hitler and Mussolini, who made the catastrophic error of going to war with the combined power of the United States, the British Empire, and the Soviet Union. But it is also partly that he was genuinely more effective as a political survivor than anyone else who has held total power in the 20th century. He eliminated every rival before they could eliminate him. He changed alliances at precisely the right moments. He calibrated risk with cold precision. He was never, in the final analysis, swayed by emotion or ideology to the point where it overrode his calculation of what was necessary for his own survival. And this is perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Stalin story. The greatest mass murderer who ever ruled a superpower was also, by most measures, an extraordinarily effective ruler. He took a poor, agrarian, deeply divided country and turned it into an industrial and military superpower in less than 25 years. He led that country through the greatest military catastrophe in modern history and emerged at the end in control of an empire that stretched from the center of Europe to the Pacific Ocean. He did this at a cost of millions of lives and with methods that violated every principle of humanity and justice. But he did it. The combination of genuine effectiveness at the macro level with genuine evil at the individual level is what makes Stalin so difficult to categorize and so important to understand. He is not the cartoon villain of Hollywood movies, twirling his mustaches in simple malevolence. He is something far more disturbing, a person of genuine intelligence and real political talent who chose again and again to use those gifts in the service of the most extreme possible form of personal power, with no constraint of conscience, law, or human feeling. The question of how many people died as a direct result of Stalin's policies will be debated by historians for as long as there are historians. The most carefully researched estimates, based on Soviet archival documents that became accessible after 1991, tend toward the range of 6 to 9 million deaths from deliberate state violence, including the executions of the Purge period, the deliberate starvation of the Ukrainian and other famines, and the calculated neglect of prisoners in the Gulag and of prisoners of war. If you add deaths from the Gulag system as a whole, including deaths from the harsh conditions rather than deliberate execution, and deaths from deportations and forced resettlement, the total rises significantly. Some historians argue for total figures as high as 20 million. The definitional and methodological questions involved are genuinely complex, and the honest answer is that we know the scale was enormous and the precise total will never be established. What can be established is that Stalin was directly responsible, through specific orders and policies, for the deaths of more people than any other ruler in the 20th century, except possibly Mao Zedong, and that this is true of a man who ruled a country that he himself claimed was dedicated to the liberation and welfare of working people. There is one final comparison worth drawing, because it illuminates something essential about why Stalin's story matters beyond the specific horrors of Soviet history. Every other major dictator of the 20th century created a system that was dependent on them personally, a system that collapsed relatively quickly once they were removed. Hitler's Third Reich lasted 12 years and ended in rubble. Mussolini's Italy lasted 20 years and ended with his corpse hanging upside down in Milan. Even Mao's China, while the Communist Party survived Mao's death, went through an immediate and dramatic reorientation under Deng Xiaoping that repudiated the most radical aspects of Maoism within a few years of the great helmsman's death. Stalin's system outlasted him by 38 years. The Soviet Union did not collapse until 1991, nearly 4 decades after the man who built it in its most recognizable form died in his dacha. This is not simply because the Soviet system had institutional inertia, it is because Stalin had built something more durable than a personal dictatorship. He had built a system of institutional terror, bureaucratic control, and ideological conformity that could sustain itself without his personal presence, that had become the normal condition of life for hundreds of millions of people over a period of decades, and that therefore outlived him in a way that no other dictatorship of his era managed to do. Khrushchev tried to reform it, Brezhnev tried to stabilize it, Gorbachev tried to save it by transforming it. None of them succeeded in creating something that could sustain legitimacy in the modern world, and the system finally collapsed under the weight of its own inefficiencies and the aspirations of the people it had suppressed. But the fact that it took until 1991 that it survived until the second-to-last decade of the 20th century is itself a testimony to the peculiar, dark genius of the man who rebuilt it from the ruins of the Russian Empire and held it together through industrialization, famine, World War, and Cold War at a cost of human suffering that remains almost beyond comprehension. Stalin was the opposite of every other dictator, not because he was worse, though the argument can be made, and not because he was more successful, though on certain measures he clearly was. He was the opposite because he operated by rules that other dictators did not follow, that other power seekers of his era could not have followed even if they had wanted to. He trusted no one. He displayed nothing. He sacrificed everyone. He changed every alliance when the old one had served its purpose. He was capable of admitting catastrophic mistakes to himself, if not to the world, and of adjusting course based on evidence. He survived. And in the grim mathematics of totalitarian power, survival is the only metric that matters. The legacy of Stalin is not a legacy that can be confined to the Soviet Union or to the 20th century. It is a legacy that raises questions that are still urgent today, about the relationship between economic development and political freedom, about the price of security and whether security achieved through terror is security at all, about the capacity of human beings to rationalize the suffering of others in the service of abstract goals, about how a system designed to eliminate tyranny can produce the most comprehensive tyranny in human history, and about how the most murderous men in history can also be the most capable organizers, the most effective administrators, the most ruthless survivors. These are not comfortable questions. They are necessary ones, and they are the questions that Josef Stalin's life forces us to ask, whether we want to or not. He was born in poverty in a small Georgian town, the son of a drunk and a washerwoman. He was educated for the priesthood and became a revolutionary. He was a bank robber and an underground organizer, a Georgian who ruled Russia, an atheist who understood the uses of faith, a man of extraordinary intelligence who wielded it in the service of extraordinary evil. He was, in every possible sense, the opposite of what he claimed to be, and yet he was also exactly what he was: the most powerful man in the world for the longest stretch, the ruler of the largest country in human history, the man who won the largest war ever fought and imposed his will on half a continent. History has few figures as complex, as terrible, and as important. And that is precisely why we cannot look away. Well, that is it for today. Thank you so much for watching. We hope you found this exploration of Josef Stalin genuinely thought-provoking, because his story truly is unlike any other in modern history. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to check out our other videos on the leaders, commanders, and hidden stories of the Second World War era. We cover everything from the fates of Nazi generals to the rise and fall of the Soviet Empire, and there is always something new to discover. Do not forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. We put enormous effort into every video to bring you history that actually matters, told in a way that sticks with you. See you in the next one.